Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered Genesis 40 and 41. In your sermon, you mentioned some connections between Daniel and Joseph. Are there any other similarities between the two of them?
One other similarity I would like to point out is that in both cases, the name of the hero is changed from their Hebrew name to the name of a name of a foreign national of the country in which they're residing. So Joseph becomes Zaphanath-Paneah, and then Daniel becomes Balthazar. But it's interesting that in both narratives, the writer refuses to refer to Daniel and to Joseph by their new foreign names. It's as though the narrator obstinately continues to refer to them by their Hebrew name, the name that, of course, is connected to the covenant promises. And so even as we see all these layered connections between Daniel and Joseph, including even that their names are changed in a way to try to synchronize them with the culture, to Egyptianize Joseph in his particular case. There is a resistance not only on the part of both Daniel and Joseph, they continue to be worshipers of the one true God of Israel, but even on the part of the narration of the lives of these men, there's this refusal to give in to calling them these new foreign names. They continue to be referred to by the names of their Hebrew parentage.
Why does Joseph say that Pharaoh would decapitate the baker in chapter 40, verse 19, when the baker was actually executed by hanging? Did Joseph make a mistake?
Yeah, kind of a morbid piece of curiosity here in the text, but there does seem to be, at least from our perspective, a little bit of a disparity between these two concepts of a hanging and seemingly the language of decapitation. Yet I think that goes away when we understand the way in which the ancient Near Eastern peoples would often publicly display the corpses of criminals in order to discourage other miscreants, or to sort of publish as a judicial warning to the people of what happens when you disagreed with or rebelled against or ran out of favor with the ruler. And so it was often the case in Egypt that after hanging an individual, that they would publicly display their corpse, usually impaled on a stake or something like that, or at least part of a corpse. And so likely both happened here. Both the baker was originally hung and then decapitated, and his head would have been displayed from some prominent place as a warning to the people, don't mess with Pharaoh. And so it's not a contradiction. This is just likely a two-part execution and then displaying of the baker. And so it's a really unfortunate set of circumstances for Mr. Chief Baker, especially when he has just heard the good news for the chief cupbearer. The baker is not headed for a good time 3 days from his interpretation.
Is there any significance to Joseph being a little light on details about his situation when he defends himself to the cupbearer in chapter 40?
I do think one thing that is interesting to note is that he just says that he was taken away by force from the land of his family and that he is wrongly imprisoned. But he doesn't say, my brothers betrayed me and they threw me into a pit and then they sold me into slavery. And he doesn't say, my master's wife tried to get me to compromise my moral character, and when I refused to do it, she falsely accused me, lied about me to my fellow servants, and then lied about me to my master, and that's the reason I'm in here. He's very light on detail. He says just enough to vindicate his own character, but without impugning the character of anyone else. And I think that's an interesting detail, because the first time we're introduced to Joseph as a lad, when he's 17 years old, or a young man at least, we read that Joseph is in the habit of bringing back bad reports about his brothers to his father. And so he's almost presented as this tattletaling youth. But by the time we meet Joseph, the faithful, persevering prisoner who is trying to honor God in his life in prison, he is no longer bringing bad reports about other people's character. Instead, he's simply standing on his own righteous character and saying, that's enough to defend myself. I don't need to actually make a case for how bad these other people have been to me. I'm just going to say, I'm here for no cause of my own misconduct. I am unrighteously imprisoned.
How can Joseph promise a favorable interpretation of Pharaoh's dream?
I think what's so interesting as we encounter Joseph interpreting these dreams is that Joseph acts as this immediate mediator between God and man, which is another interesting, of course, connection between the role of Joseph and the role of Jesus. That Joseph seems to be very confident that God will give him the interpretation of these dreams. And there's interestingly not the same kind of interlude that exists between, say, Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where he has to go back and actually pray to God that God would give him the interpretation. Joseph is pretty confident that as soon as he hears the dream, he has the interpretation. So there's this almost prophetic immediacy of Joseph's being able to interpret these dreams. And so I think in that context, we should understand what Joseph is saying is that he already understands or has been given the wisdom to know what God's disposition is toward why he has been called to present this to Pharaoh. That Joseph is going to be used as a minister of God's grace, that Joseph understands this. And so even as he's preparing to give the interpretation to Pharaoh, he understands the reason that God has him in this place. Once again, another connection to another later biblical text. We can think of Joseph as essentially being in the place that he is for such a time as this.
How can dreams be interpreted today? Do they have any meaning now?
Yeah, so a lot of Christians wrestle with the question of what do we do with the possibility of God's revealing truth or future events to us in dreams. And setting aside for a moment, for the purpose of this question, some unique circumstances, like, for example, the phenomena that's often described in the Middle East of many Muslims having what's referred to as the Jesus dream. And that's really a whole separate question that deserves its own set of answers that aren't really connected to the concerns of this text. So setting aside phenomena like that and what we should think about situations like that, in the normal course of events, is it a reality that Christians have dreams that have significance and that we should therefore interpret dreams? That's a real question that people legitimately ask, and one that comes from a series of texts like we've been working through, where Joseph seems to be a man who can't get away from dreams. He has dreams. Other people around him have dreams. Even the king of the nation has dreams, and every time Joseph is connected to these dreams. So is this a normative practice for Christian living? And when we're reading Old Testament narrative, we need to be able to differentiate the difference between descriptive texts and prescriptive texts. And the normal operating principle when we're reading Old Testament narrative in our mind should be that we're reading descriptive accounts of unique moments in redemptive history. There may be, and often are, prescriptive truths that come out of those texts that we can see and identify, and we need to be careful in the way in which we mine those out of the text. But the events themselves, and often the situations and even the responses to those situations, are first and foremost descriptive. And so we can't pull as a one-for-one point of application what we see happening in the lives of the Old Testament saints and patriarchs and say that those automatically confer to New Testament believers in the context in which we find ourselves. We need to do a little bit more textual work before we can make that prescriptive application from descriptive text. There's another layer of exegetical work that we need to do. Nonetheless, what do we do with this question, particularly about dreams? There's a large international church ministry that has a sub-ministry connected to their ministry that they call the Dream Life School of Interpretation. And they advertise some of their coursework saying, quote, God often speaks to us through dreams and visions, and he releases inspiration, innovation, invention, direction, wisdom, and much more from heaven through them. In this 3-week class, you will become equipped in the gift of interpretation as you learn the value of dreams and visions as a language from God. So this would be an example of a Christian ministry that is treating these kinds of things as prescriptive realities in the lives of believers today. But I would say that is a wrong view, not only of Old Testament texts, but of the progress of Revelation. It's a wrong view of the way in which God continues to reveal truth to men and women today. In the Old Testament, we have to recall that the patriarchs are living in a time before the coming of Christ, who is the supreme revelation of God in the flesh, and also before the fulfillment of the apostolic age and the closing of the New Testament canon. And with the end of the apostolic age, those who were eyewitnesses to the risen Christ, and the close of the New Testament canon, which when we refer to the canon, we're referring to the completion of the New and Old Testament books, so that we have one corpus of revelation in the scriptures. Once that canon is closed, the fullness of God's revelation through special acts of revelation is now complete. So we have a general revelation, which is God's acts of creation and providence that we are all able to see, and then special revelation, which is the scriptures principally. And with the close of the canon, there's no longer an ongoing need for special revelation, because we read that the scriptures are sufficient for everything that we need in life, for life and godliness, and they testify supremely to Christ. So if the scriptures are sufficient for everything that we need in life and godliness, then what new word from God do we need to receive that is not already given to us in the scriptures? Moreover, I think as we look at the New Testament age particularly, we see that many things like dreams and visions, and even the special gifts of the Holy Spirit, particularly the sign miraculous gifts such as speaking and in tongues and prophecy and miracles, those kinds of things, those were unique witnesses as to the authenticity of the apostolic message that ceased to be used in the church at the close of the apostolic age and again with the close of the canon. And so, sort of a concluding comment, I do not believe that dreams and visions and prophecies are ongoing works of the Spirit in the church age after the close of the New Testament. And therefore, when we can look back and see that Joseph, while he's living as a Hebrew in a foreign land without the scriptures and without a lot of revelation, is being directed, as many of the patriarchs were, by direct intervention of God through dreams. That is not the context of the New Testament believer who is living in an age where we have the fullness of God's revelation, and therefore we have a more sure word of prophecy, which is the scriptures themselves.
One of our listeners found it interesting that Joseph does not use his new position for revenge, nor does Potiphar object to Joseph's promotion. So, out of speculation, how do you think Potiphar's wife might have reacted to Joseph being advanced?
You know, it is a fascinating thing to think about. And of course, we don't have any reference in the text to inform us of exactly what's going on in Potiphar's household as Joseph is rising up the ranks in Egypt. And yet, I think we can see a parallel between the experience of Joseph with his brothers and Joseph with Potiphar and Potiphar's wife. You know, presumably, you just imagine Joseph comes out of the prison that Potiphar runs. We read that it's the prison that Joseph enters into is the prison that's overseen by the officer of Pharaoh's guards. Well, we already have learned that that's Potiphar. So Potiphar runs the prison that Pharaoh calls Joseph out of, and then immediately promotes Joseph to being the second in command. So Potiphar goes from one day being formerly Joseph's master, now his prison ward, to now being under Joseph, who is the second most powerful man in Egypt. And if he's in charge of Pharaoh's guard, and now all of the benefits of Pharaoh pass to Joseph, and he gets to ride in the second chariot, and he gets to wear the signet ring, presumably he has a protection detail like Pharaoh would have. Now Potiphar is providing protection to the man who used to be his prisoner. And presumably Potiphar's wife is just there steaming. You just have to imagine she's absolutely incensed. And yet it's a beautiful picture, I think, of Joseph in the same way that he doesn't use his position to crush his brothers who had tried to crush him. We have no record of Joseph seeking any kind of retribution on Potiphar or Potiphar's wife. Joseph is not only the example of perseverance and faithfulness in forgotten places, he is also, I think, a beautiful example of a man who embodies grace and mercy, not only to his brothers, but also to Potiphar and Potiphar's wife. I think we can reflect back on the words that Joseph will eventually speak to his brothers. What man intended for evil, God intended for good. And if he applies that to his own brothers, I think we can say he applies that as well to Potiphar and Potiphar's wife.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.